Hey y'all, I'm wearing my son's headset today, so I don't have my broken one from last week, which is a step up, but that's why I have a gaming headset of a 12-year-old right now. So I've titled this video Nouns Plus because in this video, we're going to talk about nouns plus some pronouns and then modifiers looking primarily at adjectives and adverbs. All right, the first thing I want you to remember is that we have a handy rule of thumb, a heuristic for spotting nouns. And the heuristic is, if you can make it plural, it's probably a noun. So if you can have more than one of it, like cats or books, it's a noun. But here's where it gets a little tricky. So there's a group of nouns called irregular nouns, and these don't follow the usual pluralization rule of just adding the suffix s or es. So for instance, the noun ox doesn't become oxes. Instead, it's oxen. And person doesn't become persons. It turns into people. Syllabus becomes syllabi, and so on. So these irregular nouns take on different grammatical forms to indicate the plural. And one form is suppletion, which is when completely different words are used for different grammatical forms. So in the case of plural irregular nouns, this is like person becoming people or cow turning into cattle. So the singular and plural form of these words have different roots or structure. Another grammatical form is apophony. This happens when the internal vowel of the word changes to show different grammatical features. So with irregular nouns and their plurals, you get foot becoming feet, goose turning into geese, or mouse turning into mice. Even man and woman become men and women through this vowel change. So the internal vowel of the noun changes to make the plural form. Some other ways we can examine these irregular nouns. We have irregular nouns where there's no change at all. The word stays the same, whether it's singular or plural, like sheep, deer, and fish. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are words that kept their original plural forms from the languages that they were borrowed from. So with these words, when these words came into English, they brought their grammatical structures along for the ride. So we have irregular nouns like syllabus and syllabi, cactus and cacti, analysis and analyses, also nucleus and nuclei. So these nouns kept their plural form from the language in which they were borrowed from. And finally, we've got some irregular nouns that use an old, like now rare plural formation. So a suffix like en, for example, ox becomes oxen, child becomes children. This en ending is a leftovers from an older form of English pluralization. That word's very hard for me. Pluralization. There we go. While today's focus is nouns, I do want to point out that these grammatical forms are not limited to just irregular nouns. So we see suppletion with verbs like go and went, and in adjectives like good, better, and best. We see apophony with verbs like sing, sang, and sung. So the lens through which we reviewed these different grammatical structures of irregular nouns can be applied to other parts of speech. So a few more notes about irregular nouns. This is a relatively small class of nouns, and these nouns are also slowly disappearing, many of them becoming regular. There's something about this regularized that I can't pronounce. So there are rarely new words created that are irregular nouns. In fact, returning to the idea of borrowing words from other languages, sometimes we adapt these words to our grammatical system. So the Arabic word serif, we borrowed this word and we decided its plural version would be serifs. So another great example of this would be the Italian word panini. In English, how do we pluralize? Make this word plural, since I can't say the other word. We say paninis. Let's go get paninis. So we borrowed this word and then applied our system of making it plural by just adding the s. The truly funny thing, though, about panini is that the word panini is actually already in the plural form from Italian. So panino is singular and panini is plural. So it's kind of a funny thing that we add an s to a technically already plural word. Okay, so putting our earlier discussion of irregular nouns aside, the important thing about nouns at large is that if you can make it plural, it's a noun. Okay, so that's the heuristic. So a nominal, as you might recall, is a unit that acts or behaves like a noun. So what's considered a nominal? Well, first and foremost, and most obviously, nouns. Nouns are nominals, but also pronouns, noun phrases. So besides nouns, the easiest to grasp are pronouns because, as their name implies, they can stand in place of nouns. So they behave like nouns. And how did we just define nominals? Well, a nominal is a unit that acts or behaves like a noun. So pronouns fits perfectly inside that definition. So nominals are inflected for number, gender, and case. And this is what we're going to unpack. The most obvious of these three inflections is that of number. Number is clearly marked all the time. How? By whether the nominal is in the singular or plural form, which is what we just covered about nouns on the last slide. So number is the best, easiest clue to identify nouns. And the S or ES suffix is a distinct morphological marker indicating that plural. When it comes to pronouns, we obviously see the distinction of number between words like I and we, where I implies singular and we implies plural. But these are distinct because but these are not distinct because of a morphological marker, right? They don't take S or ES. These are just complete different words. Okay, so we have gender, and we also have gender. So now in English, gender doesn't have a distinct morphological marker like we find in many other languages. So take Romance languages such as Spanish, for example. We have words like niño and niña to distinguish a little boy from a little girl, where the morphology is in the use of the O for masculine or the A for feminine. So however, in English, we do have gender. We have three gender classes. We have masculine, feminine, and neuter. So we have words that reference feminine things like daughter, words that reference masculine things like son, and words that are neuter like child. So this way of assignment is called natural gender. So natural gender refers to the biological or social sex of a thing, like a person or animal, where nouns are categorized based on inherent qualities rather than arbitrary rules. However, in other languages such as Italian and French, this is not the case, or Spanish, right? For instance, Italian does not have a neuter gender. Every noun is classified as either masculine or feminine. And this can be challenging, I'm told, for learners. I guess as someone who had to learn Spanish or attempt to learn Spanish in high school, I can recognize this because you must memorize the gender of each noun. So when you're learning Italian, Dr. Tardo told me, you're going to find it frustrating to remember that the word for ceiling is masculine, yet the word for chair is feminine. And why is that? Well, it just simply is. And there isn't like always a logical explanation. And this phenomenon is called grammatical gender. So in this classification system, gender is defined kind of arbitrarily, not necessarily tied to biological or social characteristics, okay? So it's important to note that English also has instances of gender classification that isn't based on natural gender, or that aren't based on natural gender. So there are cases where words are assigned a gender without like having any innate feminine or masculine qualities. For example, why would a ceiling be classified as masculine in Italian? There's nothing about a ceiling that inherently implies masculinity. And so we see the same thing in English with words like cars, boats, hurricanes, which tend to be assigned as feminine. And just to support this notion, I have a screenshot from a car blogger I found writing about a Kia where they say, "Isn't she a beaut?" And what is the pronoun she referring to? The noun car. So here you can see evidence in modern English of assigning car a feminine attribute in that sense. We're going to see this screenshot again later. So yes, while English by and large follows natural gender assignment, there are some exceptions. And while by and large other languages like Spanish may follow grammatical gender, there are also some exceptions in those languages as well. However, in English, English is one of those rare languages using natural gender. So things that are clearly masculine, things that are clearly feminine, and then there's neuter things. All right, so we are talking about how nominals are inflected for number, gender, and case. So we talked about number and gender. Let's talk about case. And understanding case can be a little tricky because unlike number and gender, it's often an invisible marker in English. It's not explicitly marked on nouns themselves, but it is visible in pronouns. So there are generally 3 cases in English that are morphologically distinct:
Nominative,
accusative, and genitive.
the nominative case.
This is the subject case represented by pronouns, the pronoun who. So for example, in the question, who did this? The word who is in the nominative case because it serves as the subject. And again, we're using pronouns because it's hard to tell with the noun. They're not marked for case, but we can see it by testing with pronouns, okay? So the accusative case, this is the same case as the oblique, which would be in the indirect case, is represented by the pronoun whom. For instance, in the sentence, I met a boy whom I like, or to whom am I speaking? Whom functions as the direct object. You wouldn't say I like whom because that's not the natural word order in English, but you would say whom I like. And then there's the genitive case. This is the possessive case represented by pronouns like whose, the pronoun whose. For example, whose hat did I take by accident? So here, whose indicates possession, though it's more accurately a relationship or an association. So traditional grammar, this is where the words, the terminology is not in its best format. So traditional grammar refers to this as the possessive, but it doesn't imply ownership, right? So when I say my husband, I don't literally own my husband, just as if I'm at a doctor's office and someone sits in my chair, I actually don't own the chair. It's just these 2 things are simply associated with me, either for that moment or however long, right? The genitive case, therefore, it indicates association and not like strict possession. So in English, case markings are limited to pronouns. Nouns like house, for instance, the house is there. That's a nominative case as the subject. It doesn't visibly change form. So to see like case more clearly, we need to switch the noun to a pronoun. So instead of the house is there, I can say it is there, and it's in the nominative case, right? I could say I see it instead of I see the house. I see it, and that's the accusative case. Or its roof is red, and that's the genitive case, okay? However, you may even need to use like gender specific pronouns to really see it, because the word it is the same in all 3 circumstances, basically, right? So that might not help you. So we can just, for the sake of the illustration, make the house feminine, and we could say she is there instead of the house is there.
So that's nominative.
I see her. I see the house, that's accusative. Or her roof is red. So the house's roof is red, and that's in the genitive position. So the point is, there are no external markers on nouns indicating case, except if I turn it into a pronoun. So someone asked, or you may be asking yourself, and I asked myself as I was creating this, what's the connection between nouns and cases? So simply put, cases provide syntactic information about the role of a noun in a sentence. So this noun is in this syntactic role. It's basically what it's illustrating. So in English, we indicate syntactic role. That was weird emphasis. We indicate syntactic role primarily by placement. So the thing that comes before the verb is the subject. The thing that comes after the verb is the direct object or indirect object, or the object. So in languages like German, Latin, Greek, there's quite a few. This information is conveyed through morphological endings rather than word order. So the endings change depending on the noun's role in the sentence. So for example, in Latin, the subject and object forms of a noun look different, So you can actually rearrange the words in the sentence without losing the meaning of the sentence. So we would call this a free word order or a freer word order language, those Latin, for example, or German and Greek, so forth. Conversely, English is a fixed word order language because word order matters. If you say Paul loves Mary, Paul is the subject. You cannot say Paul loves Mary and intend it to mean as Mary loves Paul, right? Because the order of the information matters. So case is a way to indicate the syntactic function of a noun. In English, this is mostly shown by word position and pronoun substitution, whereas in languages with like rich case systems, it's the endings of the morphological markers that tell you the role of the noun. So, and those languages, it allows for much more freedom in how words are arranged. So let's talk about the semantics of nouns, starting with the basics. So we're not necessarily covering anything radically new here, but some points might surprise you. We'll see. So we just covered regular versus irregular nouns. You're likely already familiar with proper versus common nouns, as well as abstract versus concrete. Then there's compound versus collective. So if you'd like more information on these distinctions, I've included a link in the video description. I think people do that, right, on social media, to another YouTube video where I actually discuss each of these categories in detail. So that's just if you're curious. But these are fundamental concepts you should probably know by now. And if not, you can find the video. So, however, one area that might be less familiar is the distinction between mass nouns and count nouns. So they also call this category count nouns versus non-count nouns. But count nouns like book, apple, car, these take the plural forms. So we have books, apples, cars, and they can be preceded by articles. So also numbers and some other quantifiers. So a book or two apples or many cars, right? So in contrast, we have mass nouns, words like water or sand or information, the word information. And these cannot be made plural, and they do not typically follow articles or quantifiers, especially in the same way. So you wouldn't say a water or three sands. Now, water, we'll talk about in a second, but you could say a water, right? But instead, you would use expressions like some water or a lot of sand. So there are different quantifiers depending on the type of noun. Okay, now some nouns can clearly function as both count nouns and mass nouns, as I just demonstrated with water. And it really depends on how they're used in the sentence. So this distinction often depends on whether we're referring to something as a distinct item or as a substance or a concept in general. So the word chicken, I can use it as a count noun. I saw 3 chickens in the yard. And chickens is referring to the individual birds, right? But I also can use it as a mass noun if I say there's chicken in the soup, right? So it's referring to the meat in general and not a specific number of animals. So here's how these categories are typically defined. However, what's particularly interesting is that you can often massify count nouns and countify mass nouns. And this is a form of linguistic coercion, a topic that by now you may find a bit challenging because it's a complicated thing, but it's fascinating. It's a fascinating aspect of the flexibility of language. So people do this all the time in English, and it's a natural part of the way we communicate. So for example, let's look at a real life scenario that Dr. Tardo found in a social media post, I guess Facebook Marketplace probably, where someone was selling bricks. So the post reads, 2 boxes of thin brick. And it's likely not a typo, and we can tell from the information that's provided in the sentence. So instead of referring to individual bricks, the noun brick is used in a mass noun sense. So referring to the material itself, which is being sold in bulk. So if you think about it, brick is typically like a very countable noun, right? You can easily say 1 brick or 2 brick or 3 bricks, a truckload of bricks. But here the noun has been massified to describe the substance or material rather than individual units. So on the flip side, we can consider how we can countify a mouse. My gosh, guys, it's very tired today. Let me take a sip of my Red Bull. This is not a paid advertisement. But if they want to sponsor me in my pre-tenure career, I will accept Red Bull. Okay, so let's consider how we can also countify a mass noun. And we can do that with the word flour, like the cooking substance, not like what's out in the yard. So now flour is inherently an uncountable noun, right? It's a mass noun. So you'd normally just say flour without thinking of distinct units. But what if you have various kind of flour in your pantry? So you could say, I have many flours. I have almond flour, wheat flour, self-rising flour, rice flour. There's probably more than that. So here we're actually treating flour as if it were countable by specifying different types of it. And these examples, again, illustrate linguistic coercion. Is it coercion or coercion? I never know if I just say words wrong or if it's like my Midwest kind of like accent. Who knows? So this is a phenomena, of course, though, a phenomenon where a word or phrase is used in a way that extends beyond its typical grammatical or semantic boundaries. And it involves modifying the meaning or function of a word to align it with the syntactic and semantic demands of the context, even if this usage is unconventional or unexpected. So understanding this concept helps us see, though, how dynamic and adaptable language can be, allowing for speakers to be really creative and effectively communicate like complex ideas, right? I'm getting out of breath. This is a long one today. Okay, so now let's take a look at this example here. This is kind of an aside concept and a side topic. If you're watching this video for class, this will not be on the quiz. And I'm merely including it because Dr. Tardo included it in his lecture. So I'm like, this is gold. If Dr. Tardo presented it, then I am going to present it. So, so what we have here is we just wanted to give you a sense of how English grammar can be constructed and conceptualized differently than we might expect. So we've got the famous grammarian Jesperson, whom we'll discuss in more detail when we cover the history of grammar in another video. But he introduced a useful distinction in the way we think about sentence structure with this idea of predication and modification. And predication is something you're familiar with. It's the relationship between the subject and the verb, right? There's even, what was that grammar school, like Schoolhouse Rocks? Is that what I'm thinking? I don't even know, but you know, they have a whole video on the subject and the predicate, right? So hopefully that's a concept you're familiar with. But again, it's the relationship between the subject and the verb, and we can illustrate this with an example. So I can say, Choice giggles. Now, that might be a weird example, but Choice is my baby. There's a picture of him on the slide. And he's just a little guy, and he's named Choice after his great-grandfather, whose middle name was Choice. So we liked that name. So anyways, so the example here is Choice giggles, and the subject of this sentence is Choice, and the predicate is giggles, all right? So the predication is the central element of the sentence and clause, right? So it's the thing in focus, but modification is where things get really interesting. So for example, consider the structure giggly choice instead of choice giggles. So here, giggly is an adjective modifying the noun choice, whereas in the earlier structure, giggles was a verb, okay? So Jesperson went further and introduced the idea of secondary modification, as in very giggly choice. So very modifies giggly, which in turn modifies choice. He even talked about the tertiary. Someone is going to comment something so mean on this video to me because I cannot say these words. I practice them even, but I've had a long day. So this is an example of this would be such as like really very giggly choice. So really modifies very, and very modifies giggly, and giggly modifies choice. So each layer is building upon the last. So despite the clarity and the potential of this model, right? The terminology from this model, predication, modification, secondary modification, so forth. It never really caught on in the mainstream study of grammar. However, this idea of recursiveness or recursion did, so, which is the ability and the idea of just you can keep stacking modifications. So the ability to modify, this has been extremely influential. So it forms actually the basis for many of the modern grammatical theories that focus on multiple embeddings and sentence structure. But I just wanted you to recognize the alternative models of grammar like Jesperson's here, and that they offer valuable insight. And they're just as good, if not better, at capturing nuances of language that more traditional approaches might actually overlook, particularly in this case, the distinction between predication and modification. So predication, for instance, is limited to one main verb or predicate at a time, right? You can have coordination of two separate predicates, but each predication stands on its own. In contrast, modification allows for unlimited additions and expansions. But let's continue our discussion on modifiers. And generally, there are two types of modifiers. There's adjectives and adverbs. There are also others, but we'll discuss these two here for a few minutes and really focus on them. And I'll mention the others, but we're going to focus on these two. So remember, predication is how we convey information in a sentence. When you create a sentence, you predicate something. So for example, in the sentence choice giggles, I am predicating giggles of choice. Essentially, when you say something, you say you are asserting or predicating something of a subject, and that gives you a complete sentence. Now let's talk about modifying the predication. So modifying the elements of the sentence. So consider this sentence, choice giggles regularly. What role does regularly play here? Well, it's modifying the verb giggles. Initially, we know that, from choice giggles, that giggles are occurring, but with regularly added, we learn that the giggles happen frequently or on a regular basis. So in this sentence, giggles is the verb, and I've modified it with the word regularly. So which part of speech can modify verbs? Adverbs. Adverbs can modify almost anything except nouns and pronouns, and we're going to say that again a little later. But therefore, I can identify regularly as an adverb because it modifies a verb. But another clue is the ly suffix at the end, which many, but not all adverbs have. So remember this heuristic, the ly suffix, when attempting to identify adverbs. Now, let's also consider the sentence. This is a terrible example and a terrible illustration, but ugly choice giggles regularly. I don't think my son's ugly, by the way. It just popped out as the word I wanted to use. So we still have the same predication, choice giggles, and then we have the adverb still regularly modifying the verb. But now we've added ugly, which, and what is ugly doing in this sentence? It's not modifying giggles, right? Not one of you interpreted this sentence as saying the giggles themselves were ugly, right? Instead, ugly modifies the noun choice. It tells us more about the baby, about choice. So in this case, ugly modifies the subject of our predication. Again, I don't think my baby's ugly, but terrible example. So modifiers can also modify the entire predication. So we've shown an example now of the verb being modified and the noun, the subject being modified, but I could also say, fortunately, choice giggles, or fortunately, ugly choice giggles regularly. And in these two sentences, the word fortunately modifies the whole statement or predication, expresses the speaker's attitude towards the entire situation. So in this video, we've been discussing nouns and nominals. So I want to highlight that modification can appear before or after the noun or nominal being modified. So for example, the phrase new president-elect, new is operating as a pre-modification for the noun president, and elect is a post-modification occurring after president. So we'll talk about a little more of this pre and post in just a second. So however, there is one caveat to keep in mind. And if you recall our discussion on verbs in my last video, verbs part 1, you know about copular verbs. So for instance, in the sentence choice is ugly, the word ugly is not a modifier. It's not like how it was used in ugly choice giggles. Instead, it's being predicated of choice. It serves as an adjective complement, right? It's occurring after the verb, following the copular verb is. So be careful, an adjective in a predicative position following the copular verb is not functioning as a modifier in the typical sense, okay? So let's revisit some key points about adjectives. One helpful heuristic is that you can form comparatives and superlatives by adding ER or EST to adjectives like smarter or smart, which becomes smarter and smartest. However, just so you know, this doesn't always apply. It's a great heuristic, but for example, you can't say nationaler or seriouser, right? The argument, is it seriouser or more serious? So those forms just don't exist. When it comes to derivational adjectives, they have limited morphemes, and it's important to keep those in mind. So if you remember these morphemes and the comparative superlative heuristic, you should be well prepared. Typically, it's quite clear what functions as an adjective in a sentence. But so adjectives modify nouns and nominals, while adverbs modify everything else. So in fact, the only elements that adverbs cannot modify are nouns, pronouns, the things in the nominal case, right? So if it's not a noun, an adverb can modify it. So some adverbs can be confusing because they look just like adjectives. So to determine their function, you need to examine the syntax. So in the sentence, steel is hard versus Mary fell hard, the word hard is being used. It serves a different syntactic function between those two sentences. So in steel is hard, the word hard is acting as an adjective complement. It's following the copular verb is, right? With the subject steel. However, in Mary fell hard, hard functions as an adverb, modifying the verb, which is fell, right? So that's not a copular verb. So syntax is crucial in distinguishing between adjectives and adverbs, especially since both can take comparative forms like harder or hardest, right? So modifiers, so additionally, modifiers can include nouns. We talked about how modifiers are primarily adjectives and adverbs, right? We've really hit that hard. But as I said, modifiers can be other things. So nouns can be modifiers, prepositional phrases, nominal forms of verbs, relative clauses, so they're like using a noun phrase as a modifier. So there are also untensed and verbless subordinates, which we'll cover later when discussing complex sentences. So that's another video. But essentially, modification is everywhere, while predication has only one instance per sentence, okay? That's the main message here. So in terms of modification, you can include as many modifiers as you want. And remember what I mentioned just minutes ago about pre and post modification for adjectives? Well, this applies to modifiers in general. So for instance, in giggly choice, the adjective giggly pre-modifies choice, right? Conversely, though, if the sentence were choice with the giggles, so that's our subject, right? The prepositional phrase with the giggles post modifies choice. So, and then a common rule you're going to see here is that the lighter, smaller modifiers usually come before the noun, while heavier modifiers tend to follow it. It's not impossible for heavier modifiers to precede the noun, but or the nominal. It's just less common. Okay, concept of anaphors and anaphoric chains. I'm confusing it because you'll see why. So the concept of anaphora refers to the fact that certain elements within a text point towards other elements within the same text. So For example, in a sentence, a paragraph, or larger text, there are words or phrases that can refer to something mentioned elsewhere, and it kind of creates a connection. So it's not a complicated thing to understand, but we can break it down a little more because why not? So anaphora occurs when a word or phrase refers back to something previously mentioned. For instance, in the sentence, the cat chased the mouse and it caught it. So the cat chased the mouse and it caught it. The pronouns it refer back to the cat and also the later one to the mouse, respectively, right? So you actually saw an example of this earlier in this video within this screenshot from the car blogger writing about the Kia. So the message leads off with saying 2020 Kia Stinger GT wagon, isn't she a beaut? What is she referring to? Well, it's referring back to the title 2020 Kia Stinger GT wagon, right? So this concept of anaphora and the next examples I give you, again, they're not complicated. They're just interesting knowledge, right? So cataphora is when the reference points forward to something mentioned later in the text. So for example, in this sentence, if you need it, there's a pen on the desk. The pronoun it refers to a pen, which is introduced later. Now, a quick note on the term cataphora, you might occasionally hear it referred to as backwards anaphora. There's an interesting historical reason for this terminology. So in the early 1970s, some syntacticians here in the US weren't familiar with the term cataphora. So they described instances where an anaphora an anaphor pointed forward in the sentence or text as a backwards anaphora. So essentially they were looking for something like anaphora, but in the opposite direction. So backwards anaphora. That actually refers to anaphora that's forward in the text. So it's just another example of terrible terminology issues in the field. Then we have exophora, which happens when the reference points outside of the text. So something that is in maybe the external context. So for example, in a conversation, if I say, look at that, and point to something outside, the word that is an exophoric reference because it refers to something not mentioned in the text, but understood from the context. So the core idea behind anaphora is that they serve as pointers within the text, whether within a sentence, a paragraph, or a larger discourse. So these pointers help maintain coherence by linking elements together. And in a typical sentence, you might find one or two anaphoric references, maybe three if you're crafting something particularly complex. For example, consider the sentence, Mary went to the store, she bought some apples, and then she went home and ate them. So we have here we have two instances of the pronoun she, both referring back to Mary, and then the word them refers back to the apples, right? So that's quite a bit of referential work happening in a single sentence. When anaphoric references, where they really get interesting is in paragraphs. So here I'm going to show you an example. Of course, Dr. Attardo obtained. Why does he have all the good examples? So he got this a few years ago from CNN, and I've included a link to the source in the video description here on YouTube, down below. So the article began with this paragraph. Shipping experts believe it could take days or even weeks to free the 224-ton vessel that is wedged across this canal, blocking one of the world's busiest waterways since Tuesday. The Ever Given, a container ship, and it goes on, but we can already see anaphoric references here. So the first reference to the Ever Given, starting in the second sentence, is an anaphor, right? But it functions as two types. So first, anaphora, because it refers back to the previously mentioned 224-ton vessel, right? But then it also functions as a cataphora because Ever Given points forward to the description container ship. So if you get access to the whole paragraph, you're going to see several more anaphoric references to the Ever Given, such as ran aground after being caught. It's an ellipsis indicating omitted information, but it still refers to the ship. You'll find the vessel used twice in the text, the ship used 3 times, or it, I think that's only used once. So all these items, the vessel, the ship, it, they're all anaphors that refer back to the ever given. So creating what we call an anaphoric chain. And the purpose of these anaphoric chains is to maintain like cohesion throughout the text, right? So they show that references can extend beyond individual sentences, connecting different parts of the text to the same entity and making it clear and easy to follow. All right, that's all, guys. I'll see you next time.